Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Road to Emporia. One of the big things that we really need to touch on is nutrition. Fueling on the bike is something that has really advanced over the last few years. I think the old adage of go to bed hungry, wake up skinny, uh, doesn't really apply anymore. I brought on a friend, Caleb Reese, who actually co-founded Flow Formulas, a nutrition company that I've been using and really enjoying, to come talk nutrition for Unbound. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Caleb. Hope you enjoy it. Alrighty, well, welcome to another conversation here for the Road to Emporia series. Today we have Caleb Reese, who's joining us, and we're going to talk through nutrition. Caleb is actually a PhD, owns a nutrition company, and a pretty accomplished racer himself. So, did I miss anything there, or anything else you want to tell everybody?
I think that sums it up.
Alrighty, awesome. Well, we were just talking about, kind of how I'm gonna fuel for Unbound and the challenges that come along with that, and we thought that might be a good topic for everybody to listen to. So, I guess we'll kind of jump in with, the calories versus carbohydrate discussion and a general overview of a good nutrition plan for what will probably be hopefully 12 or 14 hours out on the bike.
Yeah, so I saw that question. I think, honestly, both are tied together. You can't have carbs without calories. But I do think the biggest focus should be on consuming mostly things with high amount of carbs. But you also you want a certain amount of calories that go with that as well. So I think a lot of people, they get confused or they get lost in the weeds with carbs versus calories. It doesn't matter that much. You just want high amount of calories with mostly carbs.
Okay. So when I'm kind of planning through, how many bottles I'm going to go through or a hydration pack, we haven't decided quite yet what that's going to look like. Sounds like it's not one or the other. I need to kind of be planning for both.
Correct. Definitely. Okay. And on any of these endurance type events, really what you're looking for is carbs as your primary fuel source. You're not trying to get a lot of protein or a lot of fat in there. Mm-hmm. And most carbs, I think it's 4 calories per carb or something like that. So they're closely tied. So if you have a certain X amount of carbs, let's say 90 grams, which you want to target, then that ends up being, I think, 360 calories. Mm-hmm. So they're very tied together.
Okay. Awesome. So really, if I'm planning through and I'm using a drink mix or something that's kind of optimized for endurance, if I'm looking at calories or carbs, the other one's kind of going to take care of itself. Sounds like.
Exactly. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of people focus on one or the other, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong or right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just kind of my energy consumption. I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 calories an hour that I'm going to be burning.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we talking there? 8,000 plus calories on the day. Trying to get that back in is going to be pretty difficult. Yeah. Definitely the biggest one I've ever done. So what do you think is probably the general rule of thumb of what I can try to replace?
Yeah, so there's no way to basically get all of those calories back as you're expending it. So the goal is to just get the most amount of calories back possible. So the idea is you want to consume the maximum amount of carbs you can without experiencing GI distress in your stomach. Mm-hmm. Once you experience that, obviously your performance starts going downhill. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. If you're using a good amount of carbs that have sugars with the right ratios, you can typically get up to around 90 grams of carbohydrates, or around 360 calories per hour.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain ways some people might be able to get more than that, and then you got some people that can probably absorb less than that. So it just depends person to person. There's a lot of variation there. But that's, I think, generally the rule of thumb, and that's kind of the target for most people would be that 90 grams of carbs an hour.
Okay. I've heard different stories of, and I think this has been, kind of almost an awakening for endurance athletes now of how to fuel on the bike, and it's certainly got my attention a lot more over the last few years, where I don't just fill my bottles with water and go out and ride for 3 hours and come home and then wonder why I feel terrible. So what's the risk of I think I was listening to a podcast with Matteo Jorgensen, and I think he was saying during the tour he was consuming like 160 grams of carbs an hour, something kind of hard to imagine. What's the risks of somebody like me?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, what's the risks of somebody like me going out and trying that, even if I don't get, if I train my gut and I don't get GI distress? Am I overeating and that's just going to be waste at some point if I can only actually oxidize 90 grams? Or
I think you could waste some of that, but I think the biggest risk is GI distress. If you start basically concentrating a bunch of sugars and food in your stomach, and it's basically just going slowly through your GI tract, that's when you start feeling horrible and your performance is going to pretty much diminish. But I don't think there's no reason not to try it in training or just kind of experiment to see what you can absorb. But someone like Matteo Jorgensen, obviously this is all he does, and he does world tour. And sometimes in those types of races, I think there's times where there's like lulls in the race where you're just kind of in the pack and you're not working that hard. So you can probably absorb more calories during that time. But
so your work rate
when you're trying to push at like a steady effort.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When you're pushing at a steady effort, I think it'd be harder to get that high for most people.
Okay. So the work rate is gonna affect when and how much you can consume.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I think a lot of people, if you're doing like really mountainous type races, it's always a smart strategy to take in a bunch of calories at the top of the hill, and then when you're going down, you're not working nearly as hard. You can absorb some of that better.
Okay. Would that be...
Obviously, that won't be as big of a thing at Unbound now.
Yeah.
Hills aren't that big.
It's a lot of rolling hills, so it wouldn't even be advantageous.
I think consistency would be key for Unbound.
Cool. Yeah, and then I guess can you talk a little bit about types of sugars? How do we get more in? How do we help that absorption rate?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of sports research looking into this type of thing. A lot of more traditional sport drinks just use sucrose, which is 1 fructose and 1 glucose, and that works fine. But typically, the limit of how much you can absorb is a little bit lower. So I think, or people using mostly like just glucose sources. I think the limit is closer to 60 grams per hour of what you can tolerate, and that's because there's 2 different ways that sugar can be absorbed in your body. With glucose, that typically goes through your stomach, goes through your GI, and absorbed into your cells. Whereas fructose, that is typically mostly absorbed in your liver and then turned into glucose and then used by your body. So if you can utilize both those pathways, you can theoretically get a higher amount of sugar in your body. The other thing that a lot of people will do, instead of just using glucose, which is just one sugar, they'll use maltodextrin, which is just a kind of a chain of glucose molecules. So what your body sees when you're absorbing that is it just sees one molecule instead of a ton of individual glucose. So you can absorb that in your body with less GI distress. So using both of those, you can kind of absorb more into the 90 grams of carbs per hour, and even beyond that for some athletes. Whereas with just typical, more traditional strategies, you're more limited to that 60 grams an hour.
Okay. How would I tell what I'm actually absorbing? I mean, what's going to change? So if I go out and, I've been using Flow in my bottles quite a bit. So how do I go out and see on a training ride if I can somehow chug 3 bottles in an hour? Am I going to experience that GI distress by overloading in the first hour, or is this something I'm only going to find out 4 or 5 hours into a ride?
I mean, the GI distress can happen pretty quickly. If you chug 3 bottles in an hour, I think you would feel pretty uncomfortable. But I obviously, let's say you did like a bottle and a half, and you did 120 grams of carbs. You may not feel much, and if you're feeling good, I think you kind of are. Each of us is kind of an indicator. It's hard to like give general rules for nutrition for everyone, just because there is a lot of variation. I know some people like Mateo Jorgensen, what's his name, Adam, one of your athletes, I believe. Supposedly, I was talking to Dylan. He uses like 150 grams per hour or something ridiculous, and he can do it fine. So it's hard to like give like very harsh, like this is how it has to be for everyone. So I think just experimenting with it, seeing how you feel, trying more, trying less, I think is probably the best thing to do.
So really, if I go out on a 2-hour ride, and I think this is kind of how I would plan on testing it on myself, is go out and, do my longer rides on the weekend and just try to eat and drink as much as I can possibly get in. And then it sounds like really the only thing I'm looking for is when it starts to make me feel bad. It's probably unlikely that I'm going to be taking in more than I can handle and not have some sort of discomfort.
Yeah, I think so. And I think once you kind of figure that out and figure out like, okay, once I eat more than this, I start feeling uncomfortable and this isn't ideal, then you can kind of get an idea of like, okay, for me, let's just say I can do 100 grams of carbs per hour. Then you just kind of target that and you just aim for that in the race. But I would definitely make sure to like do all the experimenting well beforehand and have that figured out.
Okay. What about, I think probably a year or two ago, I started using the little bit of writing I've been doing, started using drink mixes a lot more. Previously I I made my own oatmeal bars and, would bring a sandwich or, something like that. But, I have found that the drink mix works a little bit better, but I have a hard time drinking enough. So how does supplementing with gels or solid foods or something like that, how do I incorporate that into my nutrition plan?
Yeah, so I really like Dylan Johnson. I kind of like his strategy. What he typically does is he uses 2 scoops of Flow per bottle, so that would end up being 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So that gives him a little bit of wiggle room. So let's just say his stomach starts feeling off. That concentration is still low enough that he can get water into his system and kind of flush out a system. Whereas if he had, let's say, 100 or even just 90 grams of carbs in his bottle, then he wouldn't be able to flush out a system as easily. But then what he does on top of that is he'll use gels to supplement. So if he feels like he needs more carbs, then he can take more gels. So like maybe some races, maybe he's doing more than 90 grams. So let's say he takes a gel in a half an hour or something. So he can kind of monitor or give like a range of how many calories he's consuming or carbs he's consuming per hour with the gels, but still get a constant amount with the Flow in his bottle. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's, it seems so simple and kind of a why haven't I thought of that before? But yeah, no, that makes total sense that You know, you're not trying to get to the peak with one particular input. You mix a couple in, and that's great.
Yeah, then you kind of have knobs you can turn once if you start feeling some GI distress, then you're going to want to try to push more toward water to try to flush out your system and absorb those calories. Whereas if you start feeling a little bonky, you can basically have gels a little bit closer together to try to get a little bit more calories.
Yeah. Okay. What should you look for in a gel or solid food? Well, I guess let's just stick with gels for now, and then we'll hit on solid food in a little bit. What should you look for in a gel?
I think there's gels. So we're trying to develop a gel, and hopefully we'll have something in the next year or so. But I think the most important thing in a gel is that you have that similar ratio of maltodextrin to fructose, just so that you're using both of your pathways through your typical GI pathway, and then also the fructose through your liver. So you want to make sure that it has both of those carbohydrates in it. The other thing, some people are really picky about, like some people really don't like the really high viscosity gels because they feel like it just gets like stuck in their mouth. Some people, and so there's like more watery gels. Some people don't like that. Those take up more space in your pocket. So I think making sure you're happy with whatever you're using is important. But yeah, I think the most important thing is just making sure it has those two carbohydrate sources.
Okay. Yeah, I've used a few different brands, and I think I've got some that I like, but I don't know that that's because they make nice flavors that I enjoy, and they seem to go down easy, but I don't know that they're the best. But it sounds like they have pretty good sugar content, and I can tolerate them.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm looking for.
Yep. Okay. Exactly. And you touched on different flavors. I think that is so important for a race like Unbound, where you're out there between, well, let's say anywhere up to 15 or more hours. I think having a variety of flavors, maybe even having different random candy or different types of snacks at the aid stations. You're not going to know necessarily what kind of things that you're going to like suddenly start craving out there. Yeah. So having some variety to mix it up. The worst thing that can happen is you just get tired of whatever you have, and then you just stop consuming as many calories, and then you're going to bonk really hard. So that's like the worst thing that you can do. So I think it's really important to have a variety of flavors and just different options to make sure to keep you eating.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to get into all my weird quirks through this series, but I did an event earlier in the year, and strictly for palate fatigue, I filled a bottle with half water, half pickle juice, just so that when I got tired of the sweet flavor, I could take a drink of pickle juice. So, but I love the flavor of pickles. So I told a few people that, and they looked at me like I had two heads. So, yeah, same idea though, just something that was a different flavor, so I didn't get tired of the same flavor all day. So.
Yeah, it's very important.
Yeah. So what about solid food? I think one of the things that kind of has me struggling to wrap my head around is all of my events that I've done. Really, I've done a few centuries, but my whole background when I was riding a lot more was criterium racing and a little bit on the velodrome. So maybe I would take a gel or have a little bit of water in my bottles, but being out there for 12, 14 hours, I have a hard time wrapping my head around not eating something solid that day. So, but I've also done the mid-ride burrito and felt pretty terrible coming back. So how does solid food play a role in an event like that?
I think that goes into personal preference. A lot of people can just do like more viscous type fluids. So like just drink mix or gels or chews. Some people really like they start feeling like really hungry because they haven't chewed on something. So for them, it's definitely important to have some solid food. I think the important thing with solid food is just making sure that it is mostly carbs. I think with like the mid-ride burrito, I think the problem is you have like a ton of fat in there and a ton of protein, and that ends up being less carbs that can get into your system, and those fats and proteins are kind of displacing that a little bit, and those take a lot longer to turn into glucose, so that you're not going to get energy as quickly from those. So I think as long as your solid food is mostly carb, I think you're fine.
Okay. Yeah, because I think my understanding is that can basically just sit in there, and your body's more or less trying to process the protein and fat and not processing the carbs, right?
Exactly.
So block it.
And I think the other thing is when you eat solid food, don't eat like a whole meal out on the ride. Eat like a half a bar at a time. Put it back in your pocket, ride another 20 minutes, and then eat the other half. And so instead of like overloading your system, I think it's a little bit easier on your body if you just eat smaller bits at a time.
Okay, that makes sense. What about, so I think to me it kind of sounds like I need to go and do, thinking through this plan in my head, I need to go do some testing on my own and figure out how much I can get in, and you know, for anybody that's watching this and planning on doing a big ride themselves, go figure out how much you can get in without upsetting your stomach. Then figure out how I'm going to fit all of that on a bike, and the plan from there seems pretty simple. So I guess the other topic that I think you probably have some pretty good insight to is coming into this, 8,000 plus calorie day. How do I make sure that I'm as topped up as possible? Am I eating? Do I eat pasta for 3 days straight and nothing else? Are there different types of foods that I should try to focus on the night before, the 2 days before, the morning of? How does that play a factor?
Yeah, so I think all of us have probably heard of carbo loading.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's exactly what you want to do. I think Dylan would probably know more exact numbers, but I think 2 days beforehand is when you really want to start eating mostly carbs. There's a bunch of review papers out there that talk about like how many carbs per kilogram body weight and whatnot. So you could probably figure that out with a coach and get a good idea of what is the exact amount you want. But basically, you just want to eat mostly carb-heavy food and eat a lot of it.
Okay, so
same goes for the breakfast before you start. You want to eat a really big breakfast with a lot of carbs, not so much that you're feeling horrible at the start line, but enough to give you a good start for the day. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like if I eat a pretty carb-rich, rice and beans or some kind of one of the athletes we work with a lot is Alexei Vermeulen, and I've seen some of the meals that he eats, and I think he did like a cup or 2 cups of rice or something and 5 eggs before one of the races in the morning. So it goes to show that it really is, or really can be, a eating and drinking competition. So
yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of rice. That's impressive.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, any other?
I think one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing to add to that, I think you want to make sure to have at least practiced your quote unquote carb loading beforehand. You don't want to try that for the first time at Unbound, because you could eat too much and you're just feeling bloated and horrible at the start. So that's obviously not ideal. So I think it's important to kind of try the strategy out at a race you don't care about as much, or just try the strategy out for a really big long ride that you're doing that weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Any other nutrition tips day of or leading up to? How do I make sure that eating and drinking isn't the reason that I don't finish this thing?
I think, like you said, I think the biggest thing is this is in some ways a eating and drinking game, and if you can stay on top of both of those, I think you'll be fine. But once you start like forgetting to eat and forgetting to drink, that bonk is gonna come real quick, and it's not gonna feel good. So
yeah,
trying to stay on top of that to keep the likelihood of that happening as low as possible is the goal.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think one thing I have done really well over the last couple of years is eat and drink. So, but that's probably why I'm in probably in this position of doing the whole couch to Unbound project. So, awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you coming on and giving me some advice, and I think should have a pretty good nutrition strategy going into June. So, awesome.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and best of luck. I'll be rooting for you.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll have. I'm sure we'll see you out there if you're racing. And do you know if you're doing Unbound or not?
I haven't decided yet.
Okay.
I did it last year, and it was really hard. I felt pretty horrible. So
yeah,
maybe I haven't. Yeah, I'll have to decide here soon once the lottery opens.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, awesome. Well, if we get to see you out there, maybe we can get a meal together or something and get a few more carbs in before the start line. So that's awesome.
Sounds great.
Well, thanks again, and hopefully everybody here got a little bit of takeaway to plan their own, or just see how much I can consume in a few hours. So, all righty. Well, thanks, Caleb. We'll talk with you soon.
Thank you. All right. Have a good one.
Alrighty, well, thanks for watching another episode of Road to Emporia. Thanks to Caleb for joining and being a part of it. Really excited to have him on board, and at least know that nutrition isn't going to be the reason why I can't get to the finish line in Emporia. So if you have any questions, as always, reach out, sales@silca.cc, or leave a comment here below, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can.